Hi, everyone, and welcome to Unit 4. In this unit, we are thinking about the gray zone between sanctity and heresy in the Middle Ages by examining the lives of three women who were not officially declared as saints, but nevertheless took on spiritual authority in their lifetime by imitating the suffering of Jesus on the cross. So, we're thinking a lot about asceticism and suffering and how these ideas really build into this concept of purgatory that develops in the 13th century. Despite the numerous restrictions to women's agency in this period, women really used their piety and asceticism to carve out new space for themselves in society as powerful agents of salvation. And they really represented their spiritual authority and significance to all of Christendom as parallel to that of Jesus. So, really powerful expressions of spiritual authority. By sharing in the suffering of Jesus on the cross, these women asserted that they were helping to save sinners from damnation. And so we're going to unpack exactly what that means in this unit. And we're really going to think about how women started to use their piety to claim a new role in God's plan for salvation. And in particular, to claim a role that started to rival that of the clergy. So let's get into it. So you might have noticed that you have a little bit less readings for this week, but I don't want you to go without important historical context. So I am going to pack a little bit more into this lecture than into the previous ones, but the information you're getting really builds directly upon the things you've already learned in the previous units, and it's also going to be really relevant to the next unit. So this lecture kind of is serving double duty in that sense, and I really hope that you'll watch it all the way to the end. But just in case you don't, I want to go ahead and introduce you to the women you will be reading about this week. So first, there is Marie of Ogny. We also have Christina the Astonishing, or Christina Miraculous, and then there's Mechthild of Magdeburg. So all of these women are Beguines, and I will explain what that means a little bit further in the lecture. But for now, I'm just going to give you a basic framework for understanding who they are. So as I mentioned, Marie and Christina both are Beguines, and they both die in the early 13th century. Marie lived in modern-day Belgium, as did Christina, and Marie is actually considered by historians to be the first real archetype of what it means to live as a Beguine, or rather, her piety and her imitation of Christ really becomes a standard for Beguines moving forward. So Marie frequently meditated on the suffering of Jesus, and she regularly fasted. And ultimately, she was said to have been blessed with this gift of copious tears that frequently resulted in prophetic visions and messages from God. She embraced a life of chastity and charitable labor, but she didn't take vows of enclosure. So this meant that her piety was really on display for the community. And naturally, it inspired many women who had like-minded ideals about spiritual perfection to follow her example. However, like a nun, Marie's devotional life was heavily influenced by her collaboration with the clergy, and particularly by her relationship with her confessor, Jacques de Vitry, who validated her visions and spiritual gifts. Plus, he wrote her hagiography, which we'll be reading, and really promoted her as a saint after her death. Christina also lived in modern day Belgium, and she likewise experienced prophetic visions from God and was given this gift of copious tears and this supernatural ability to endure all forms of pain, as you'll see. Her confessor, Thomas de Cantimpré, asserts that her imitation of Christ was absolutely perfect. And it was this perfect imitation of Christ's suffering that empowered her to have these really crazy feats of superhuman strength and superhuman abilities. So the best example of this imitation of Christ is that he actually says that just like Christ died on the cross and was resurrected, Christina begins her spiritual journey at age 21 after she's resurrected from the dead. And from that point on, Christina is involved in all sorts of really radical and pretty disruptive forms of asceticism, but she ultimately views herself as part of God's plan to save others from damnation. And she has good reason for thinking this, since she was brought back from the dead, right? Um, this is just to say that her asceticism was ultimately so radical that not everyone agreed if she was actually possessed by God or possibly possessed by a demon, right? It's hard to tell with resurrection which source that is coming from. So we're going to think about kind of that ambiguity in her text a little bit as well. And then finally, Mechthild of Magdeburg lived until 1282. So she's living really squarely in the 13th century. And she's also a Beguine, not in Belgium, but sort of in the Rhineland of Germany. So kind of upper Germany, not too far from where Marie and Christina lived. But Mechtild's story diverges just slightly from the others because she took vows of enclosure and became a Cistercian nun toward the end of her life. And that really falls in line with trends that we see in the 13th century of Beguines really being regulated back into the traditional place of women in the church, that is in the cloister. But the cloister that Mechthild joined was actually very progressive and really famous for their scriptorium, or rather their production of devotional manuscripts. And many of the nuns have to use their piety to claim a mystical union with God, very similar to the way Mechthild does. So although she's inside of the cloister, she's still in a very empowering environment, you could say. And this is actually where Mechthild finishes writing her devotional treatise, which you will read a little bit of for this unit. So one thing about Mechthild that's really special and maybe different from the other women, like what you saw last week, is that her treatise is written in the vernacular German. And this really highlights that she was hoping the text would be read by the laity, and she was really cultivating her reputation as a prophetic authority. Mechtild's imitation of Christ also centered around suffering, and she likewise received prophetic visions while in a state of intense meditation. And it's those visions that she records into her treatise, very much like Hildegard, right? But again, she's doing this in the vernacular. Mechthild also used her physical pain as a way to save sinners from hell, and she really thought of herself as embracing this pain to ensure humanity's forgiveness of sin. So she has that in common with Marie and Christina. None of these women, as I mentioned at the beginning, were declared as saints, but they were all recognized as prophetic figures in their lifetimes. And as I mentioned, they had to collaborate with the local clergy. So it's not as if they were automatically viewed with suspicion. Quite the opposite. They were generally embraced. But it's important for you to think about why after they die, why their legacies don't continue, and why the church doesn't continue promoting them as models for other women. So I'm now going to shift gears and give you a little bit more background to understand why women would use self-renunciation and suffering as a source of agency at all in the 13th century. Because despite the obvious hardships involved, there's this reality, right, that this is ultimately something that is going to result in a premature death for many of these women. So while it's giving them a source of agency and it's giving them the ability to take on authority that's otherwise being denied to them, it's also a really steep cost. And it means living a life that is not comfortable, and embracing hardship and embracing pain. And we really should think about why that was seen as desirable by these women. So let's get into that a little bit. As I mentioned in the lecture last week, the 12th century has been described by historians as a renaissance because of the way society became restructured and the ways in which people's lives and quality of life generally improved in many ways, largely thanks to new technology, new systems of land management, scientific understandings, etc. Education became more accessible as universities were established throughout Europe. And initially, these universities were created really to educate the clergy, but other fields of study flourished as well, particularly medicine and law. And this is also the moment that guilds and urban laws are really established. And there's this extensive interconnected trade that's happening around the Mediterranean. So luxury goods are becoming more accessible, and people generally, because of this new technology, have more free time. They don't physically have to be in the field as long if they have this new plow that cuts the time in half, right? So this leads to a rise in artistic expressions as well. And you might be familiar with songs of the troubadours or literary stories of chivalric love that begin to circulate at this time. However, despite all of these positive advancements, not everyone's lives improved in the 12th century. As the social hierarchy became more elaborate, the merchant class took on more status in society, and women across the board are really displaced from their positions of power, pretty much, like I said, in all areas of life. So they're losing control of their wealth and family estates because of the creation of new inheritance laws. Women could no longer serve as civic administrators because all of the positions came to require a special university education, which of course women were excluded from. In the same sense that women couldn't become priests, they also could not study at university because one of the requirements was that you had to be a part of the clergy to join the university. So there's just this gendered exclusion that's being replicated from the church hierarchy into the social hierarchy, and the two are very much entangled. There were fewer female midwives and pharmacists because, again, doctors became legitimized by their university education, and women couldn't receive that education, or that official education, I should say. And women were likewise increasingly excluded from guilds. And the guilds that they could stay in, their labor was marginalized in. So men gradually even took over the skilled labor that was traditionally viewed as women's work, such as brewing ale and producing silk. And in this way, medieval society really in the 12th century start to redefine women's significance full stop by their ability to produce heirs or perform domestic labor. So labor that's specifically in the household and not in public. Renouncing marriage and embracing the apostolic life of Jesus then became a way for women to really subvert these expectations in the 13th century. So, as I mentioned last week, the socio-political marginalization of women in society was coupled with the church's efforts to suppress women's ability to preach in public and the promotion of strict vows of enclosure for religious women. And it follows that the religious experimentation of the 12th and 13th centuries became one of the main avenues for women to reclaim some agency and authority in the church. The Beguine movement begins at the end of the 12th century, kind of the beginning of the 13th century, really during the lifetime of Marie of Ogni in Belgium in particular. So the women that we're looking at are really indicative of this movement that's happening in the Low Countries. And you can see this area on the map. It's this wedge between the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire or Kingdom of Germany. And basically, the name Beguine comes from their actual life of prayer and begging. And in this sense, their embrace of apostolic poverty was really similar to Clare of Assisi, albeit they're doing it outside of the cloister. So they're really more like the kind of male Franciscans, like Francis of Assisi, in the way that their kind of vocation and understanding of their spirituality is really embedded in their position in society and their ability to interact with the poorest members of society directly. In terms of demographics, we know that women who became Beguines typically moved from rural areas into these urban centers where they would then dedicate themselves to charitable labor. They typically came from noble families, but they could also come from lower class families, and most of the time they found someone who would be a patron for them, who would support their pursuit of spiritual perfection and really enable them to devote themselves entirely to their communities. So Beguines are generally not married, obviously. If they had been married, they would come into this role once they had been widowed. And what happens is they begin to form kind of informal communities, frequently in convents located next door to churches. So the poor would come to the church to receive their ministry, and the women would be ready to assist. And you can see how physically, in terms of space, they're occupying a space in the urban center that's very similar to what clergy are occupying in this moment. So they're physically traveling in their communities to care for the poor and minister to the dying. And as the papacy tries to regulate women's religious devotion and maintain the patriarchal nature of the hierarchy, Beguines' mobility became a real point of contention, and also their visibility. So many communities of Beguines in the 13th century were forced to take religious vows to become more like cloistered nuns, if not cloistered nuns explicitly. And basically, this is a way of restricting their spiritual labor and confining it to designated spaces like hospitals or leper houses or orphanages. And it's also ensuring basically that these women who are oftentimes single or, as I said, widowed, are not out in public on the streets, and they're certainly not allowed to be preaching. Beguines like Marie and Christina, who did not take vows, nevertheless were still under the supervision of a priest who acted as their confessor. But the relationship could be more collaborative than explicitly oppressive. So as you will see, Jacques de Vitry and Thomas of Cantimpré, they look to Marie and Christina as examples of spiritual perfection, and they really endorse their prophetic union with God and confirm it to the public. Yet, you will also notice that even though they stress that these women are perfectly imitating Christ, they are very careful and shrewd to not say that others can achieve the same results. So the message is really that these are extraordinary women, exceptional cases, like you should admire them, but don't try this at home kind of thing. And their ability to endure pain, their ecstatic fits of tears, and their prophetic visions, they're all signs of God's awesome power, but these are not spiritual gifts that just anyone will be given. So you'll notice that their aestheticism is framed as spectacular in the sense that it was very incredible for other people to witness and also generally disruptive, like a spectacle would be. And it's therefore not surprising once you see their piety in action in the text and you think about this context, it will not surprise you to know that Pope Gregory IX actually formally forbids women from preaching in 1228. So just after the death of Christina. So Marie and Christina are at the beginning of this trend of Beguines and this kind of new form of piety. And then you can see Mechthild is coming at the end after the church has started regulating this religious devotion more and more explicitly. By the end of the 13th century, the papacy actually associated communities of Beguines and specifically communities that centered around women who were claiming prophetic authority as heretical. And so we'll talk a lot more about that and heresy next week. But for now, just keep in mind that once we're in the mid to late 13th century, communities of Beguines are actually charged with heresy, and you do start to see Beguines burned at the stake. So there's a lot of real political consequence to the forms of devotion that you will be encountering in the readings for this unit. Let's see. Okay, so this brings us to the Second Council of Lyon in 1274, a major moment in church history for a number of reasons. But for this class, you just need to know two things. One, that at the Council of Lyon, the clergy and the Franciscans in particular call for the regulation of Beguines by the church, and specifically, they call for their enclosure. And two, this is also the moment when the church actually defines purgatory. And they define it as a place of purification through which souls can pass on their way to paradise. So, without getting too deep into the theology or the historical background for this idea, I really want to explain the spiritual significance of purgatory to women and the women's understanding of suffering as a form of penance. The belief that suffering could lead to the purification of one's sins stems from the basic idea of divine justice and various stories in the Bible, but most importantly, the story of the crucifixion. According to theologians, when Jesus suffered and died on the cross, that was his payment for the debt of original sin. And this is something we've briefly gestured to in previous units, but basically everyone is born with original sin. So in order for everyone to have the ability to enter heaven, it was crucial for God to send Jesus to suffer and die in this way. And this is what is understood as the plan for salvation. So the problem with this plan, or it's not necessarily a problem, but the point of issue in this plan, the reason everyone can't just be born and immediately go to heaven after their death, is that humans also have free will. So sin is ultimately going to accumulate throughout one's lifetime, but you're starting with a blank slate. You're not starting with sin, is basically the idea. So according to church doctrine, all of the sins that one accumulates throughout their lifetime, those individual sins incur a new debt to God that must be paid on an individual level through penance of some kind. And generally, this penance is some form of asceticism, such as fasting, but it could also be prayers, donations to the church, pilgrimages to a specific church or to the relic of a saint. And basically, this physical act of penance allows one to return to a state of spiritual purity. And that state of spiritual purity is seen as essential to entering heaven. So you can see how this is a spiritual economy, so to speak. The laity is really relying on the clergy to restore their purity and reconnect them to God. And they do this by confessing their sins and then being told by the priest what sort of penance is required to get back to that original state of purity. So this is a lifetime endeavor, obviously. And the same system of confession and penance is still in place in the Catholic Church today. So you can see this is a really big moment in terms of defining church doctrine and Christian values associated with sin. The reason that the church really needed to define purgatory as a concrete place is that people often died without having paid the debts for their sins. And you can think of this in really practical terms, right? Maybe they died unexpectedly. They had just told a white lie. They were on their way to church. They would have asked for forgiveness, but they died on the way there. Or perhaps they had already heard what penance they needed to do, but right as they were walking out of the church, they had a heart attack. So they weren't able to make that donation, even though they intended to. Or even worse, perhaps it's a child and the child passes away before they really understand the severity of sin. And so this really creates a major point of anxiety in the laity's minds. Hell is a terrifying reality, and without the assistance of priests, people really believe that they're not going to be able to enter heaven, and that is where they will end up. They will end up in this state of eternal punishment for their failings. But they also recognize that there's a lot of gray zone between what is a personal failing and what is an institutional failing. What sins was I not made aware of, perhaps because my priest himself was very sinful? So you can see how discourse on the presence of sin and corruption in communities that's spinning out from the Gregorian reform movements in the 11th century, it really puts this new spotlight in the laity's minds on their concerns about the afterlife. And it really, again, emphasizes this fear about the fates of those who are just dying too soon. And you can also see how the rise of crusading really kind of puts more pressure on the situation. The circulation of diseases, like in the 14th century, the Black Death, this puts more anxiety and pressure on the situation. And people are really just uncomfortable with the idea that God would condemn all sinners to eternal damnation for small menial sins, right? So what does it mean if your intentions are good, but you just can't quite live up to the standards of saints? To answer this problem, theologians in the 13th century, they really kind of imagined this sort of in-between area where souls would go to pay for the debt of their sins that they accumulated while alive. But they would have this kind of in-between space to prepare them to enter heaven. And that is what we now know as purgatory. So if nothing impure can enter heaven, that certainly has to be the rule. But, and this is a big but, there's nothing saying that when you die, you immediately have to go to heaven or hell. So the theologians were able to establish this as sort of a liminal space. It's not a pleasant experience. It's not a get out of jail free card. It's a place that's imagined as purifying through very physically painful fire. And your soul will suffer there for many, many years, depending on the extent of your unrepentant sins. So there's still a real incentive on living a good life and being a good person and having a good relationship with your clergyman, and going to confession. All of those things about being a good Christian are still incentivized, but there is this kind of safety net that's now in place for them mentally, so they can have some sort of inner peace with the understanding of that, the reality of sin. So although suffering is involved in purgatory, the concept of the intention of the heart being what God will ultimately judge is something that gave people a lot of great ideological comfort, because it means that anyone that truly was a good person would ultimately be taken into heaven. And these standards that they were being held to, they were supposed to strive for them, but it would not actually mean their eternal damnation if they didn't live this perfect life on earth, like saints. Or also if they didn't have a good priest, right? So it creates more flexibility in the economy of salvation. Um, as I mentioned, it also gave people peace of mind about the fate of children who perhaps didn't live long enough to be baptized or repent for their sins. Certainly, if God is a God of love, how could God condemn children to eternal suffering in hell? So this is also the moment when you get the concept of limbo. And we won't get into that now, but I'm just gesturing to this so you can kind of understand the real imaginative ways that people are starting to take ownership of their spirituality. Holy women in particular imagine themselves as taking on the suffering of those souls in purgatory through their personal pain on earth and through their intense emotional connection to Christ. So they would have these really intense meditative experiences in which they imagine themselves suffering on the cross like Christ. And by feeling that pain in this lifetime, they are taking on the debt of others, and they're carving out space for themselves as mediators in this economy of salvation. So they're making it even easier for lost souls to make it into heaven, particularly the lost souls of people that they knew in their lifetime, so or their deceased family members. So a lot of women's prayers became really fervent and really focused on, taking on that debt of sin for their deceased relatives to ensure that all of their family members could make it into heaven. And their self-sacrifice then was linked to Christ's sacrifice on the cross. So for a woman to say, I'm going to give up all comfort in this life and suffer every day in the hopes that my pain will bring everybody else into heaven, is a really powerful statement. And you can see how if the clergy is seeming particularly corrupt, you might look to this holy woman for more moral, spiritual support. And you might take her prayers even more seriously, right? Because you're kind of uncertain if what the priest is doing is actually effective or not. But what she's doing seems to be really powerful, and it seems to be working. So basically, women from all stations in the 13th century really embraced this idea that their bodily suffering could be substituted for the suffering of souls in purgatory and even the suffering of souls in hell, and physically bring more souls into heaven by remitting them of their sins. And in this, you can see how this gives women a sense of purpose, even though it has all of these hardships involved. Their violent forms of charity and self-denial in the margin society literally were said to benefit all of Christendom. And elite women in particular, as I said, found a new religious purpose because they couldn't manage estates in the way that they used to, but they could have family significance and communal significance by praying for the souls of their dead family members and praying for the souls of those crusaders who went off to fight and spread, Christendom, but ultimately died before they could ask for forgiveness of their sins. So women became really important mediaries, very similar to priests. And communities of Beguines fit directly into this picture, right? Because they are entirely focused on this apostolic suffering and prayer. And basically, they are linked to the spiritual health of their local communities because they are suffering and praying and essentially protecting everyone around them from sin and demonic attacks. So you can see how Mechthild, even though she makes it into a cloister, she's coming out of this really intense moment of devotional purgatorial piety. And she definitely doesn't see herself as being restricted in terms of her agency by her vows of enclosure at the end of her life. She still very much sees herself as participating in this economy of salvation. Okay. This brings us to the end of the lecture. And I really just want to kind of leave you with this thought that purgatorial piety is not always transgressive in the Middle Ages. And in fact, this type of purgatorial piety and suffering was recommended to holy women by priests, as we see in the numerous stories of female saints that were written by men. So this is a very powerful model of sanctity, and it is a very appealing model of sanctity to the laity and even to the clergy. But there's a lot of conditions placed on the women who actually strive for this model. So women are encouraged to relate their suffering more to the Virgin Mary than to Christ, particularly because Christ was the model for the clergy. So in the 13th century, you also start to see this idea that Mary was a co-redeemer with Christ. She emotionally suffered with Christ while watching him die on the cross, and she is idealized for her submission to God's authority in the same way. So her submission to God's plan for Christ to die is very much the same as Jesus Christ's self-sacrifice and willingness to die. And according to medieval theologians, this made her essential to the bigger plan for salvation in the same capacity as Christ. But Mary was still a woman, right? So there's also this real discourse on the ways in which Mary conformed to the gender ideals of humility and didn't preach like the apostles. And so you can see how women are being encouraged to identify with Mary's maternal pain and suffering, but also in doing so, keep their piety private. So it's perfectly fine to suffer, and it's encouraged that you would suffer on behalf of the sins of others, but you shouldn't do it in public in a way that would rival the importance of the clergy. Beguines naturally then challenge this expectation by performing their radical acts of asceticism in public. And their piety particularly became transgressive when they associated themselves with Christ instead of Mary, figuring themselves as Christ's spiritual partner. And you'll see this idea come up in the text for this unit. And if these women could imitate Christ's suffering perfectly, there's also this sort of slippery slope that perhaps they could also become like the priests, and actually, why wouldn't they be able to have control of the sacraments if they were co-redeemers with Christ? So many clergymen, as I said, are looking to Marie and Christina and Mechthild as prophetic figures, and it really calls attention to this sort of weird paradox where women are both idealized, and their suffering really makes them important spiritual authorities, but they're also still systematically excluded from positions of power in society just because of their gender. So keep that in mind as you do the reading, and think about how Marie, Christina, and Metzschild are making claims of authority through their physical embrace of pain. And ask yourself, what about their visions? What about their prophetic kind of wisdom would have provoked clerical anxiety and made them into perhaps a dangerous model for other women to follow? What ideas in the text seem transgressive to you? And to what extent do you think that they are envisioning themselves as part of God's plan for salvation in equal capacity to Christ? So it will be hard, I think, for you to read about their pain and view it as empowering by modern standards. But I hope you will reflect on how these medieval views of feminine weakness as a spiritual strength really led to women praying and proving their sanctity to others by enduring pain and embracing physical torments in increasingly radical ways. So it creates this ideological space to really understand suffering as a form of agency. So hopefully this gives you enough context to work through that, and happy reading.